Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be finishing up the spinal cord and we'll be continuing on into the brain. And just a reminder that next week we have an exam. It'll be on Thursday the 30th. That exam is going to cover chapters 11, Introduction to the Nervous System, Parts of the Neuron. It's going to cover chapter 12, the spinal cord, that we're going to finish up today. It's going to cover chapter 13 on the brain, and also 14, which is the autonomic nervous system. I should have no trouble finishing up the spinal cord today and getting about halfway through the brain, maybe not quite halfway through, but I'll easily finish up the brain on Thursday. That'll leave us just next Tuesday with a short discussion about the fight or flight response, the autonomic nervous system. On that exam also will be vocabulary through 72. So let me go through some more of those slides. In fact, I think I'll be done with vocab early. I'll go through some today. I'll finish up vocab on Thursday, and you'll have all the vocab in your pocket before the end of the week. Also, let me strongly encourage you not to wait till next Tuesday to start all of your mastering assignments. Please, we've already finished 11. We'll finish 12 today. Please try to get some of that mastering assignment done this week, and then get through the brain done this weekend, so that next week you've only got one mastering assignment left to do on the autonomic nervous system as you walk into the exam. If you wait till next week, it really becomes too much, too late. It just can't be mastered, right, as well as it should be. Are there any logistical questions for me related to anything at all in the course? Short papers, a couple have come in, thank you. Most of the people who didn't listen to the lectures last week and weren't aware of the extension. But short papers, if you have any concerns about those at all, let me know. Remember, I extended it to the Tuesday going into Thanksgiving week. Yes?
Are you checking for punctuation?
We're in college.
Okay, but are you going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb?
I'm a science guy, so I'm not looking for, dangling participles and run-on sentences. But no little I's, no little I's and no little U's and, little R's. It's not a text message. No, you'll be fine. Yeah. No, you'll be fine. I'm quite confident. In the short paper, my goal of the short paper is to assure that you have the skills necessary to find out more about whatever topic you're looking for. Right? So I need to know that you have the computer and library skills necessary to go find good research articles about the topic of your choice. You are going to become the advocate for whomever, your patients or your family members. You, now having been through anatomy and physiology courses, you will be able to speak far more intelligently and completely with your nurses and healthcare workers. And when a family member is diagnosed or prescribed a medication, I want to know that you can go on and do some decent research and come up with some reasonable conclusions based upon that. So this short paper has many, many different facets to it. One is to make sure you can do research. Number two, I stay current, right? I get to read about all these papers that you're finding about topics of your choice, and it keeps me current as well. So, and in the end, you get 50 points for following the directions and doing what's been asked. So it's a win-win, okay? So take some time with that. The research librarians are very aware of this assignment, and students who have already contacted me and asked about some research issues and getting to certain journals, and the research librarians are waiting to answer your questions. So they don't get utilized as much on this campus as they probably should, and they can't wait to help you. So stop by the library if you have any concerns at all about how to get to a particular journal or how to better search for papers related to this assignment. Vocab. Okay, so I think we went through 63 last time, if this looks right to me. So we went through O and ovum last time, egg. Let's pick up with 64. And OP, think optics related to vision. And ophthalm, think of ophthalmology, the study of the eye. Opsy is the viewing of something. Autopsy, biopsy, necropsy, these are all viewing processes. Remember, auto means self. So an autopsy is the viewing of self, not like you're looking at yourself, but looking at one of our own type, right? Autopsy. Or biopsy, looking at living tissue, right? Bio meaning life. Or a necropsy, looking at a dead body. We typically use the word necropsy to refer to an animal, right? Where we use autopsy when we're referring to one of our own. Oral, O-R, referring to the mouth. Orbi, Orbicularis, right? It's an orbit. It's a circular structure. Orchid testis. This one's probably not that familiar to you. Orchiditis would be inflammation of the testes. Ortho, you go to the orthodontics or have orthodontics done to straighten your teeth or correct your bite. And ori, pertaining to, so sensory pertaining to your senses. Oscopy, viewing, laparoscopy would be viewing of the abdominal area. Os, full of. Osis, a condition of osteoporosis, a condition where the bones are becoming more porous. Osmo, push. We talked about osmosis and the movement of water across the membrane. And we said that that was a passive process, and it is. There's no ATP involved. But there is a pushing, sort of an osmotic pressure that is happening. So osmo refers to push. Something is pushing that water across the membrane. Ossi and osteo referring to bone. Osteo, we saw that term a lot. Ostomy, an opening. So formation of an opening. Odo, the ear. Odogenic, something that begins in the ear. If you're taking, if you go to your cabinet and you may have some odic drops, right? They're meant for only for the ear. Papillae or papillae. We'll see this term a lot as we go through the course. We've already seen it once. When we were looking at the skin, we saw that the dermis was composed of two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And the papillary layer was the one higher up next to the epidermis, where there were those peaks and valleys. And those peaks and valleys sort of look like a nipple-shaped structure, so that's where that papillary layer comes from. Then otomy is to cut, and we'll finish up with this group today. Para, near or beside. Paranasal, near the nose. Paravertebral, near the vertebra. Par, birth or labor. So postpartum, right after birth. Parietal, we saw that term with the serous membranes. Remember, there's a parietal layer and the visceral layer. The parietal layer was on the wall. Pathy, some disease. Pathology, the study of disease. And finally, pecto, chest. We've seen the pectoralis major. So we'll go through just 72. We're going to go through plasia, right? Through plasia on exam number 4 next Thursday. So let me bring us back to this slide. We are in the spinal cord chapter. And the slide that I want us to go down to is where we finished up. And it's this slide right here. And does that agree with you? Do you agree with that? That's where we got? Okay, and I've started here, and I said I'll pick up with this slide next time. And I probably also said to you, if you have a chance, go ahead and print out this slide in a bigger format. Because this is just a densely packed slide. There's a lot of really important information on this slide. And this is one of those slides, if you can stare at it and integrate all of what this slide tells us, then you have a very good understanding of the spinal cord. So let me begin with this. And first thing I'm going to do is go over here to the 4 sections. I see somatic sensory. Oop, I shouldn't be crossing it out. That doesn't work, does it? Okay. I see somatic sensory. I see visceral sensory, autonomic motor, and somatic motor. Those 4 categories. And what do those 4 categories refer to? If you go back to one of the first slides of chapter 11 as we started the nervous system, and there were those boxes, right? The nervous system can be broken up into sensory and motor. And the sensory could be further broken down into somatic sensory, visceral sensory, motor into somatic motor and autonomic motor. Can you picture that table, that slide with the boxes across the bottom? So what that tells us is that within a nerve, that there are neurons doing each of those 4 types, right? They're responding to different neurons within the body. So this is the nerve, right? And within that nerve, what is a nerve? A nerve is a bundle of axons that are all traveling together. And within that nerve, we have some neurons that are somatic sensory, What are those neurons carrying? What kind of information are those cells carrying? Somatic sensory. You might want to go back to that same slide or right next to it. Skin, information from the skin. Taste, your senses, your vision, your taste, your touch, smell. All of those things that are coming from the outside of your body are somatic sensory. There was another very key word here that I wanted you to know. The ability for you to know where your body is in space. Your awareness of self starts with a P. Proprioception, right? Your knowledge of your body's position, even when your eyes are closed, you know that you're sitting or standing or that your arm is bent. All of that information is coming through these somatic sensory neurons. Then there's visceral sensory neurons. These neurons are carrying information from where? From your viscera, from your organs. This is my bladder's full, my bladder's empty. My stomach is full, my stomach is empty. My heart is beating, my lungs are working. All of your internal systems are also sending signals to your spinal cord and brain through these visceral sensory neurons. Then, also traveling in the same nerve are going to be neurons that are motor neurons. Some of these motor neurons will be autonomic motor neurons. They are carrying information to where? To the involuntary things of your body, which would include cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular secretions. Also, in that nerve, there would be some somatic motor neurons. Those somatic motor neurons are carrying information from the spinal cord to skeletal muscle, your voluntary muscle. Very good. So we recognize then that in your spinal nerves, you have a bundle of axons, and within that bundle of axons, remember we have the fascicles, and we've got the layers of connective tissue in a nerve, we've got the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. But within that nerve are going to be bundles of axons, some of which are identified as each of those four areas. Now, the two blue ones are sensory. The other name for sensory neurons? Afferent, right? You'll hear afferent, but I'm going to say afferent to really overemphasize the A. Afferent. And I think I told you that afferent neurons are always going to travel in the back door of the spinal cord, right? If you're having an affair, you're going to go in the back door. It's horrible, but it works as a reminder. So the afferent signals are going in the back door of the spinal cord. That is, those afferent signals are going to travel in this posterior route. And they're traveling toward the back side of the spinal cord. Now, while we're here, let's also remind ourselves, what are these little pushpin looking structures? These are sensory neurons. Those are the cell bodies for these sensory neurons. And the shape of those neurons is said to be unipolar. There's one pole, right? There's your neuron. It comes out one pole off the neuron, and then it comes to a letter T. So that's your unipolar shape, right? That's the morphology of those sensory neurons. And those neurons, those cell bodies, are all in this bulge, in this cluster area. And that is referred to as a ganglion. A ganglion, look back, I've said it a couple of times, I've written it a couple of times, it didn't make sense yet, but a ganglion is a group of, a cluster of cell bodies. Okay? So we see this cluster of cell bodies in this bulge. That bulge is called the posterior root ganglion, right? It's a ganglion in the posterior root. It's also referred to in other books as the dorsal root ganglion. Same thing, dorsal or posterior. So these neurons are bringing in this sensory information. It's going to come in the back door. Do you agree then that this posterior root is only carrying sensory information? The posterior root only has blue neurons, right? So these are the sensory neurons. So everything that's traveling into the back door is going to be sensory. Those sensory neurons are going to synapse with interneurons. neurons found only within the spinal cord or the brain. Those intraneurons are then going to process and integrate this material that's coming in, and then they're going to send their signals out on motor neurons. Two kinds of motor neurons, either autonomic motor going to your involuntary structures or somatic motor going to your voluntary muscles. Those signals are only going to travel out the anterior route. So everything in the anterior route is going to be motor. And then we see that those two routes, posterior and anterior, combine once again to make the entire spinal nerve. That's a lot of stuff, right? But it's a lot of what we've been discussing, bringing it all together onto one image. There's even more here. What questions do we have so far? Pulling this whole thing together. Is everyone okay with the idea that a nerve is a bundle of axons? And that bundle is going to include neurons of 4 flavors, right? Somatic sensory, visceral sensory, autonomic motor, and somatic motor. What else? There's a couple more things on here. Yes, ma'am?
Referring back to afferent, is afferent another word for sensory?
It is. So afferent, right? E-A-F-F is information going in or toward. We learned that way back. AF meant toward, fer meant to carry, right? So to carry toward the spinal cord, carry toward the central nervous system. Then the motor signals are also called efferent. EF, away from. Okay, so to carry away from. What else is on this slide? You see these regions. There are 4 different colors. What do we call this region of the spinal cord? That blue region would be best called the posterior horn, right? The horn. Some of you, Thursday group, you already had this lab last week. Tonight's group, you're having this lab tonight where you'll be labeling parts of the spinal cord. But the gray butterfly is broken up into horns. So that blue area is pretty much the posterior horn. On the side, what's sticking out? Lateral horn. And then more anteriorly, that would be the anterior horn. That's gray matter, isn't it? Okay, here it's in 4 different colors just to show you this. Now, there's another word over here I need to introduce to you. I don't think I said this word last time. And that is nucleus. Okay? Now, nucleus to most of us means the center of a cell where the DNA is found. But in neuro world, neuroscience, it also refers to a cluster of cell bodies found in the central nervous system. Okay, there's a couple of slides coming up that are going to define this for you. But a nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies found in the central nervous system. What color, let me clean this off. What color, this butterfly is what color? Gray. Why is it gray? Because it doesn't have myelin, right? And what parts of neurons don't have myelin? Dendrites and cell bodies. When you look at this picture, oh look, there's a lot of cell bodies right here. There's a lot of cell bodies down here. So another word to describe this group of cell bodies would be a nucleus. The blue ones would be the sensory nuclei. The orange and yellow would be the motor nuclei. While I'm thinking about this, let me put a little chart up here. There's 4 things, actually 3 things that I want you to keep track of. So when you are in the PNS versus when you're in the CNS. We've talked about each of these. Let's make sure we got it in one place. So when I'm dealing with the PNS, if I am referring to a nerve, right? What is a nerve? A nerve is a group, a bundle of axons all traveling together, protected by the same connective tissue layers. If I'm in the peripheral nervous system, that's a nerve. If I'm in the central nervous system, that bundle of axons traveling together is instead and called a tract. Okay? what cells make the myelin in the peripheral nervous system? This one we should know. So in the PNS, I have Schwann cells. Remember how they arrange? They circle their own, the whole cell, right? It circles just a small portion of the axon. However, if I'm in the CNS, I instead am going to have myelin made by, oligodendrocytes. Okay. Now the last little distinction I want you to make, a cluster of cell bodies found in the PNS is called a ganglion. We saw it a moment ago, that posterior root ganglion. What was it? That bulge was all the sensory cell bodies, right? Cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. If I'm in the central nervous system, we don't have ganglia, we instead have nuclei plural, nucleus singular. It's one of those unfortunate words, right? It has so many different meanings. Okay? So keep track of those three different sister combinations. They're important that you know that they are the sister structure for PNS versus CNS. What do you think? Coming together? If it's still a little fuzzy, it's going to get more clear as we continue through this. I'm going to give you a few more ideas. We've got two things to keep track of here, I think. There's the vocabulary. There's a significant number of new words. But there's also concepts. How did this stuff all go together? Right? So you've got two things. You've got new vocabulary to deal with. And you've got this very practical level of how does this, you tell me a lot of stuff. Why do we care and how does it go together? Hopefully the second part is going to start making sense to you right now. How does this go together? So you know that coming off your spinal cord, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Those 31 spinal nerves are broken into 5 different categories. Remember there were cervical. How many of those are there? Did I go through this? I think I did. If I didn't, I'll go through it now. Okay. So cervical, there are 8. Thoracic, 12. Lumbar, 5. Sacral, 5. And there's one called the coccygeal, CO. Sometimes CO or CO1. That's your 31 pairs of nerves. They're coming off the spinal cord, and they're associated with each of the vertebrae of the same name. Those spinal nerves, as we saw in the picture before, are really a combination of the incoming sensory and the outgoing motor neurons. That is, the information going through a nerve is bidirectional, right? If I have the femoral nerve in my hand, in the femoral nerve, there's both sensory and motor information going through that nerve. However, the information is traveling through different axons. And the information traveling through any individual axon is unidirectional, right? In at the dendrites, through the soma, and down the axon. What we just saw a moment ago is that all of the motor axons, they originate in the spinal cord, right? Their cell body was sitting there in the lateral or the anterior horn of the spinal cord. We saw too in that last image that the anterior root only carries motor information and the posterior root only carried sensory information. Those two roots combine to make the nerve itself. Along the spinal cord, there are actually many rootlets. I showed you a picture of an actual spinal cord, that cadaver image, and it almost looked like little hairs coming off the entire length of the spinal cord. Those are the little rootlets. Those little rootlets are going to combine into these posterior and anterior roots. You have 31 spinal nerves. Like I said, they are associated with each of your vertebrae. When referring to the nerves, you'll hear C2, C3, C4. It's the same word we would use for vertebra, C2, C3, C4. So you've got to look at context. So if they're saying there's something wrong with C2, you have to ask yourself, is that vertebra C2 or spinal nerve C2? Look at the context of the conversation. In the lab, when we saw the model of the spine, actually that vertebral column spine, the one that was hanging on that metal stand, all you saw coming out between the vertebra was the yellow nerve, right? You only saw the nerve. What you never saw was the root on the inside, and you also never saw how that nerve is going to branch once it leaves the spinal cord. The branches, picture coming, each of those branches is called a ramus, okay? Ramus singular, rami plural. Okay. Now there's a posterior ramus. The posterior ramus is really quite small. It makes sense. The spinal cord is already very posterior in your body. There's not a whole lot further behind the spinal cord. So there's a small branch coming off your nerves called the posterior ramus. It's going to go to innervate, connect to the muscles of your back, and also receive sensory information from your back. The vast majority of your spinal nerves is going to head more anteriorly in what's called the anterior ramus. It's much, much larger. There's just a whole lot more in front of your spinal cord than there is behind it. In the lab and in tonight, I'll mention plexuses. A plexus is a group of nerves that travel together. We're going to be going through the plexuses very carefully this evening. And it's actually these rami, the posterior, it's actually the anterior rami. It's actually the anterior rami that cluster together to form these plexuses. Let's take a look at this picture. This may be one of those aha moments for you. I hope it is if you're struggling with this conceptually. We've got a cervical vertebra here. No problem. We've seen this before. We've got the spinal cord sitting here within the vertebral foramen. What we've never seen before, though, is that we've got muscle here now, right? So there's some muscle of the back that's surrounding the spinous process and the transverse processes. Coming off from the spinal cord is, coming off from the spinal cord, there's your nerve, and here's a branch. That's the posterior ramus. The much bigger one is the anterior ramus. The posterior ramus, what's this nerve doing? What's this nerve carrying? This branch of the nerve is going to be receiving sensory information from the skin on your back. If I tickle your back, you're going to know it because those signals are going to travel through this posterior ramus. And there's also motor information coming out of this telling those muscles of your back to contract, to move. Your posterior ramus is rather small. Your anterior ramus is much bigger. There's a lot more to do. I want you to circle this, and we'll talk about it in chapter 14. This is the sympathetic trunk ganglion. That little ear ring or eardrop or ear ring kind of structure right there, a little droplet. We'll come back when we get to the fight or flight response. When we get to the sympathetic nervous system, we'll look at that again. And next Tuesday, I'll say, remember when we saw that vertebra with the muscle attached to it? And I'll come back and I'll show you this picture again. It'll mean something more to you, but I want to point out this sympathetic trunk ganglion. What's a ganglion again? Group of cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system. This ganglion, just to be very clear, is not the one we were talking about a moment ago. A moment ago, we looked at this bulge up here. That would be the posterior root ganglion. Okay, so we're talking about two different ganglia here, and we'll come back and look at that. Let's see if we can't pull this together even better. Your body is receiving sensory information from all over the surface of your body through your spinal nerves. Actually, all of your spinal nerves except for one, C1, is involved with your feeling something on your body. Each of these little segments of your skin is referred to as a dermatome. Derm, right? Skin. And I'll show you a picture of the dermatome in a moment. And what it basically means is that if I can feel different regions of my body, that different spinal nerves are working, right? I've got the right sensory information coming in. Let's take a look at this dermatome map. And before I go there, let me also say this referred pain, and I'll come back and talk about referred pain later. If someone's having a heart attack, what do they usually describe? What are the warning signs, or what are some of the symptoms? The heart is not receiving oxygen, right? There's problem, there's a lack of oxygen going to the heart muscle. But these patients will also complain of or describe what?
Jaw pain.
Maybe jaw, left arm, right? Radiating pain down the left arm, crushing pain in the pectoral region. Some people will just complain about lower back pain, right? They don't even have any pain at all in the chest. And this is more of a there seems to be a different presentation in men and women, but women will sometimes not feel that crushing pain. They won't feel the pain going down their arm. They'll complain about back pain. A little different for different people. Here's what's going on. That's called referred pain. The heart's in trouble. You're feeling the sensation of trouble on the surface, right? Down the arm, in the chest, in the back, in the jaw. That's referred pain. Let's figure out what's going on here. So this is a dermatome map. You can see that the body is broken up into these segments, and each segment is identified as one of the spinal nerves. If right now you have good sensation to your neck and shoulder region, that means that your C4 and C5 spinal nerve are working fine. If you can feel your chest and abdominal region, right, T1 all the way down to T12, everything's fine, sensory. If you can feel everything going down the front of your leg, lumbar. Those who already had lab last week, you know that the lumbar plexus, we're going to get there in a second, but the lumbar plexus was the nerves coming off the lumbar, and they go down the front of the leg. So it makes sense that the lumbar nerves are going to give you sensation down the front of the legs. Your sacral nerves travel down the back of the leg. So the majority of your butt and the back of your leg is going to be sacral. The coccygeal nerve gives you sensation at the bullseye. Okay? And that's all the coccygeal nerve does, CO. Okay, so the heart is innervated in part internally. Remember we have visceral sensory. The heart is sending signals to your body through some of the thoracic nerves. And so when a person is having a heart attack, right? The heart is screaming, I'm in trouble. And it's sending those signals out, but the brain has a hard time interpreting what that means. And so the person will experience also physical pain on the surface of the body at these dermatome regions. And I have a better slide coming up for you next time when we finish up this conversation. But different internal organs will have pain on the outside of the body, because the signals basically get crossed, or the brain has a hard time interpreting the pain signal. Is it coming from the internal organ, or is it coming from the surface of the body? So there's some of this crosstalk. Referred pain. This slide is something that you don't have to learn about, but I had a student about 4 years ago who's had a relative who did reflexology. I don't understand this, but out of respect for her, I included it in my presentation. Reflexology is a study of the body's connection with the foot, primarily. And a reflexologist would argue that if you're having pain perhaps in this area, number 25, that you have an issue with your kidneys. And if instead you had a pain or problems coming from here, that you would have problems with, I don't know this chart, obviously, your mid-back, right? I don't know where these connections come from. This is more of an Eastern medicine connection, not something that I understand or appreciate. So don't worry about reflexology. But I do want you to understand, though, are these dermatomes, and know that the neck and the arms were largely cervical. The chest and the stomach and the abdominal region was largely thoracic. The front of the leg was lumbar. The back of the leg was sacral. Also, appreciate the significance of spinal cord injuries. If a person has damage to their spinal cord, this red line is critical. Oops. This red line is critical because any damage above this red line is going to leave that person as a quadriplegic. A quadriplegic is an individual who has lost use of all four limbs or has very, very limited use of their arms. But basically, they have limited or no use of all four of their limbs. Below that line, you're going to be a paraplegic. That means your arms are okay, but your legs are affected. So, a person who has injury at C4, the red is their area of paralysis. They would have sensation on the face, and that's about it. If they had injury at C6, also still a quadriplegic. So up in the cervical region, quad. If you're down in the thoracic region or lumbar region, then you are going to be a paraplegic. Now, if you look at the difference between damage to T6 area versus damage to L1 area, the difference is in the trunk muscles. A person who's a paraplegic who had damage at T6 is probably going to have trouble staying up in their wheelchair. They're going to need some extra support to maintain their posture in the chair. A person who had damage at L1 is going to be able to sit very nicely, have great postural control within the chair. They don't have use of their legs, but they have much better postural control. So you can look at a patient who's in a wheelchair and sort of imagine where their damage would be based upon this. Remember that damage is going to be, so if you sever something at C6, you have use of everything from the brain down to C6, right? But everything below that, C7, C8, thoracic, lumbar, sacrococcygeal, those nerves are not going to be able to work. What are you losing? Not only are you losing motor movement, but you're also losing sensation from all of those areas.
If you have back surgery for severe pain, they're going through abdominally now. Is that because of the risk factor of paraplegia?
Partially. Yeah, so some spinal surgeries are now done more abdominal, right? They're more ventral. But that is coming through the back, right? You've got a lot more issues. You got a lot of nerves to work around. So yeah, there's a little bit more safety, I guess, in going from the front. Yeah.
I was always told with the injuries to like C4, the nerves that control C4 also control the diaphragm.
Hold on. You're one slide. You're two slides ahead of me.
Okay.
Slow down. Now, good stuff. Give me just a moment.
Sure.
So, types of paralysis, 3 types that I want you to be aware of. These are basic types: hemi, para, and quadriplegia. The gray, the lighter colored area, is the area of paralysis on this particular image. So hemiplegia, hemi means half. This is the kind of paralysis one would see in a stroke patient. There's been damage to the brain, and you probably know that there's a contralateral relationship. Damage to the right hemisphere is going to leave me with paralysis, potentially, on the left side of the body. So that's going to be very much a hemiparalysis. This is the person walking in the mall, and you see them walking, but you kind of see them dragging their left leg or the right leg. They're kind of dangling their arm, and they've got some sort of hemiparalysis, okay, following a stroke. Paraplegia, as I mentioned, they've got a break in the thoracic or lumbar regions. They still have good use of their arms. They don't have use of their legs based upon where the break is. And in quadriplegia, something in the cervical region, and so we have no use of arms or legs. Now, the nerves that come off the spinal cord in 4 places will form a weaving, a group, a cluster called a plexus. And really what's weaving together are those anterior rami that I showed you earlier. Most of the nerves in your body, femoral nerve, sciatic nerve, phrenic nerve for the diaphragm, your ulnar or radial nerve, there are 11 or so nerves that you're responsible for knowing from the lab. So you'll see them tonight, or you already know what I'm talking about. And those nerves are all coming from the cervical plexus, from the brachial plexus, from the femoral, or from the lumbar plexus. I'm going to read this to you. It's not going to make any sense yet, and it will in a moment. Most nerves, femoral nerve, ulnar nerve, radial nerve, are actually composed of pieces of multiple spinal nerves, so that if you damage one of your spinal nerves, it may not completely wipe out the nerve. So hold on to that thought, and let me explain this to you. Now, the only nerves of your body that are not going to cluster are going to be your thoracic nerves. And the reason is when your thoracic nerves come off from the spinal cord, they're already separated by the ribs. Okay. And these thoracic nerves are also called the intercostal nerves. The nerves enter between the cost, the ribs. Right? So the intercostal nerves are your thoracic nerves, and because they are separated by the ribs, they don't have the opportunity to cluster. And that's shown here. You can see the nerve coming off. Here's that little branch. That would be the posterior ramus. Here's the more substantial anterior ramus. And you can see how they are separated by the presence of the ribs. Let's go through these other plexuses, though. 4 plexuses. What you need to know for each of these plexuses is, 1, which nerves are making that plexus. The cervical plexus is a combining of C1 through C4. Okay? C1 through C4. So cervical 1 through cervical 4. And in the cervical plexus, there's only one nerve that I'm going to ask you to know. There's only one nerve from the cervical region that you had to know for lab, and that was the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is very important for you to know. It is the nerve that controls your diaphragm, your ability to breathe on your own. The phrenic nerve is derived from C3, C4, and C5. So the phrase goes like this: C3, C4, C5 keep the diaphragm alive. Okay, so if we look at this, and I know it's small, but here is the phrenic nerve. I would never ask you to label that down there, but there's the phrenic nerve. And if you follow this nerve, where is it coming from? A portion of it's coming from C5. A portion of it's coming from C4. And a portion of it's coming from C3. Okay? So C3, C4, and C5, branches of C3, C4, and C5 are all combining to make this nerve we call the phrenic nerve. If you had damage to C2, I mean, we're talking way high, right? Way high. If you had a break at C2, you would lose all control of your phrenic nerve and you'd be on an iron lung. You'd be on a respirator, right? Unable to breathe at all on your own. You'd be a quadriplegic with no ability to breathe. If you had a break a little bit lower, let's say you had a break at between C3 and C4, or maybe at C4, C5. What would you expect about your ability to breathe independently? Some, but not perfectly, right? Because let's say the break is here at C4, C5. You still have what? C3 and C4 are still intact, aren't they? And that means that your phrenic nerve would be not completely, but primarily okay. You would have maybe a little less than perfect control, but you would still have some ability to breathe on your own. If you had the break up at C3, C4, it tells you down here that, or somewhere it tells you this, yeah, mostly C4. So the phrenic is mostly C4, some from C3, some from C5. Anybody know Christopher Reeve, right? Superman? Anybody ever see him speak after he was in his equestrian accident and was in the wheelchair? And he was respirator dependent, but not completely. You could watch him speak, and then he would take a puff on the respirator support, but he had some control. It was not perfect, but he had some control. So based upon that, and I need to look this up, where would you expect his break to have been? Probably between C4 and C5. He had, or maybe C3, C4, but he had some control, but not total control, right, of his phrenic nerve and of his diaphragm. So you start to see the idea, right? So you have the cervical plexus. It's made up of branches of C1 through C4. The only nerve you need to know from this region is the phrenic nerve that controls the diaphragm. If on the practical exam there was a sticker up on the flat Stanley nerve model and it said, name this group of nerves, it would have to be the cervical plexus. If instead a sticker up in the neck on the flat Stanley nerve model said, name that nerve, it would have to be the phrenic nerve. My point is, I'm only asking you to learn a few nerves, right? So as always, keep your learning inside the box of what we're asking you to know. Let's go on to the brachial plexus. This is the group of nerves that come off from C5 to T1. C5 to T1 makes up the brachial plexus. Come on, there we go. These are the nerves that go to your arm. And in your arm, there are 5 nerves that we've asked you to know. Right? So all of these 5 nerves that you need to know come off from the brachial plexus. This one's the most obvious on the models upstairs. There's this big cluster of nerves that travel right across the shoulder to the arm. Brachial plexus. From this plexus, we are going to gain the musculocutaneous nerve, the median nerve, the axillary nerve, the radial nerve, and the ulnar nerve. Those are the 5 you need to know from lab, 5 you need to know for here, that come off the brachial plexus. Now, take a look at this image. That's the brachial plexus. This is no small, insignificant structure. So if you were the surgeon and you were doing surgery to the shoulder, the good news is the brachial plexus is very obvious. It's large. The bad news is the brachial plexus is very large, right? So you would have a higher chance, potentially, right, if you're not as highly skilled or made a small mistake, of nicking one of those nerves and causing permanent damage to the arm during that surgical procedure. Okay, so this is up in the shoulder region, that group of nerves coming off the spinal cord, right? You can see the spinal cord. Oops. You can see the spinal cord, or not see it, but you can imagine these nerves are coming off from the spinal cord. They're traveling together to the arm, brachial plexus. So what are those 5 nerves? Those 5 nerves were, right, here they are, axillary, median, musculocutaneous, radial, and ulnar. 3 of these are super, super easy because we know the bones already. So the nerve that travels along the pinky side of your arm is the ulnar. The one around your thumb is the radius. The one down the middle is the median nerve. Then up for the armpit, there's the axillary nerve, and there's also, axillary nerve is more toward the deltoid, it's more external. And then there's the musculocutaneous nerve. The musculocutaneous nerve travels right along the humerus. Right along the humerus. Now, each of these nerves carries a different set of information. Carrie, go ahead.
Going back to the cervical nerve, if you cut a nerve accidentally through surgery, there is no fixing it at all, like ever. So you're screwed. Patient's screwed. That really sucks. My friend just recently had back surgery and they went abdominally and now he's having testicular issues, like he has constant testicle pain.
Yep, so something got nicked, something got hit, something,
So
yeah.
his testicles will hurt the rest of his life.
There's a chance that the body will stop caring. So sometimes they can do a nerve block. So there's something going on that's sending us a pain signal all the time to a part of his body. They might be able, sometimes the body will kind of give up on that and kind of say, okay, I get it. Thanks for telling me no, it hurts, and it will kind of stop. But sometimes they'll have to go in and do a nerve block, and they'll actually have to go in and stop that signal or delay that signal from traveling. So there's some things that can be done. But they're probably going to make him wait until there's a point at which we're pretty confident that this is not going to resolve on its own. Yeah. So we have our 5 nerves. Now, this is not to memorize. This is part of that conceptual, bigger picture idea. So there is the axillary nerve. The axillary nerve is one of these coming off from the brachial plexus. It comes down and it tells the deltoid muscle to work, right? It's the motor. This is the nerve that sends motor information to the deltoid muscle. It also sends motor information to one of the rotator cuff muscles, the teres minor. Not to memorize, just to appreciate. Not only, so this little nerve sends motor information to those 2 muscles. It also, though, is sending receiving sensory information from this point. So if you can feel over here on your shoulder deltoid region, then you know that your axillary nerve is picking up sensory information just fine. Then it tells you specifically that the axillary nerve is derived from C5 and C6. Right? The phrenic nerve was C3, C4, C5, and the axillary nerve is C5 and C6. We see overlap, don't we? Okay. Also, not to memorize, but just to appreciate, the radial nerve. You're picturing it going down along your thumb. Okay, but it goes down along the way. It's also going to innervate a lot of muscles. Many of them we didn't learn about, but a lot of muscles of the forearm are innervated by the radial nerve. Sensation. If you can feel down the majority of your arm, if you can feel in the antecubital region, if you can feel down to your palm and most of your thumb, forefinger, and middle finger, then your radial nerve is working fine. It is derived from C5 and T1. Okay, C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. A lot of nerves, a lot of rami coming together to make the radial nerve. Last one, ulnar nerve. We picture it going down the pinky side. There's definitely some muscles of the hand that we haven't dealt with that are dealing with this. But have you ever been working on the computer, or maybe you were resting in bed or reading in bed, and your elbows were down, and all of a sudden you realize, or maybe you fell asleep, and now your hand's kind of sleepy, and your pinky's gone to sleep. The next time that happens, I want you to kind of do a little further analysis. What you will notice, yeah, your hand's sleepy, all the areas here in kind of part of your hand, your pinky will be sleepy on both sides. You go to your ring finger, only the medial side will be sleepy. The lateral side will be fine. The ulnar nerve goes right across the olecranon. Right? So when you got your elbow down, you pinch off that ulnar nerve, your pinky goes to sleep, a little bit of your hand goes to sleep, and just one side of your pinky. These nerves are very, very specific in the areas that they send to and receive information from. So the other side of your pinky, the other side of your ring finger would be fine. Okay? The median nerve would go down the middle. The radial nerve does more with the thumb. So you kind of get that idea. Let's move on now to the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus, this is a group of nerves coming off the lumbar vertebra. This includes L1 through L4, so almost all of the lumbar nerves. There's three nerves here that you're going to know about: the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, the femoral nerve, and the obturator nerve. Again, you're just going to be recognizing these nerves on the flat Stanley model upstairs. Again, this is not an insignificant structure. These nerves are traveling, through the pelvis, breaking through along the os coxa, going down the front of the leg, along the femur. Here are your three nerves to know, right? The femoral nerve, your obturator nerve, and the last one was the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. If you look at this, the obturator nerve, oh, look at it, it's traveling right through the what? The obturator foramen, right? Got to be the obturator nerve if it's traveling through the obturator foramen. The largest nerve traveling down the front of your leg is going to be the femoral nerve. And then the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, as the name suggests, is more lateral toward the outside and closer to the surface, cutaneous, skin. Sorry about that. Same idea, not to memorize, but just to appreciate. For example, the femoral nerve, right, is derived from branches from L2 to L4. It is going to give you, right, the femoral nerve is going to give you sensation down the front of your leg and is going to control many of the muscles of the quadriceps femoris group. That makes sense, right? It's in the front of the leg, front of the thigh. That makes sense to us. Lastly, there's the sacral plexus. This is derived from L4 through S4. So there's some overlap there, isn't there? L4 goes to the lumbar plexus, but also contributes to the sacral plexus. These nerves are all going to come down and go down behind and go down the back of the leg. You see the sacral nerves coming through the dorsal sacral foramina, right? And these nerves, or the sacral plexus, is going to go on to form, most importantly for us, the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is the longest and biggest nerve of your body. So again, you see it. I'm not going to ask you to label any of these cadaver images, but very substantial structure. As you're looking at the cartoon, you're going to see the sciatic nerve come down the back of the leg. Right about the popliteal region, the back of the knee, you're going to see it split. It's going to split into the tibial and the fibular. Okay, the tibial and the fibular nerve. So let's take a look. So here's the sciatic nerve. Touched it. Sciatic nerve coming down the back. Right here between the condyles of the knee, it's going to split. One down along the fibula, one down along the tibia. Not difficult at all. Now, people will have issues with their sciatic nerve. Remember, it's L4. Oh, I didn't tell you that. L4 through S3 makes up your sciatic nerve. So it comes down along the back and can have shooting pains going down. If you've ever had sciatic pain, right, it can shoot down the back of the leg. It can go down pretty far even. It can even shoot all the way down to the heel. Pregnant women oftentimes will complain in the last couple of months about some sciatic pain. People with obesity issues will sometimes complain about sciatic pain. What's going on? Right, it's L4 and L5 are contributing to this nerve, the sciatic nerve. L4 and L5, lumbar regions. A pregnant woman or a person who has some extra weight on the front is going to have more lordosis. Remember that curvature of the lumbar vertebra. And that curvature can pinch off these nerves, L4 and L5. And so you're going to have some blockage and some pain radiating down the sciatic nerve. The solution for that is have the baby, right? Reduce that lordotic change, or lose some weight, stop that gut from pulling back on the lordosis of the L4 and L5. This is also the most common place for nerve blocks and for surgical intervention for lower back pain. They're shooting for L4, L5. That's where they're shooting for. All that, they're going to put all that numbing medication into L4 and L5.
So you can pinch your sciatic nerve, can't you?
That's what you're doing. I mean, yes, but most of the sciatic nerve pain is going to be because the curvature of the lumbar vertebra is going to pinch off. If you are curving those vertebra, picture up here on the screen, then as those vertebrae are pinching down, the intervertebral foramen is going to be shut down.
Just from instead of turning your back the wrong way, or.
But it's still up here. You turned your back the wrong way, and what did you pinch? L4 and L5, which contribute to making your sciatic nerve. Absolutely. So it doesn't have to be pregnancy or obesity. You can just injure your lower back and still have sciatic pain.
If you have sciatic issues while you're pregnant, can it help if the baby moves?
Just to relieve that, whatever is pushing at that moment. If the baby shifts, then yeah, it might relieve some of that pressure. Absolutely. Yeah. Are we getting the idea? Right, that these spinal nerves are doing what? Bringing in sensory information from different regions, different dermatomes, different sections of your body, and each of these nerves is assigned to sending motor instruction to your skeletal muscles. What I haven't talked about, and I'm not going to be, but these spinal nerves are also assigned to going to certain organs. So some nerves are going to your heart, to your stomach, right? And that's where that referred visceral pain comes from, because the body's a little bit confused on those things. Question? That's pretty much it for the spinal nerves. Let's talk about reflexes for a moment, because reflexes are something that your spinal cord does all by itself. So reflexes are automatic, rapid, involuntary. I don't have the word repeatable here, but repeatable is also true. And a reflex is a protective mechanism. It is something that is going to occur even without your voluntary conscious awareness. Typically, you're moving away from pain. So you burn yourself and you reflexively pull away, even before you were consciously aware that you were burning yourself. Or you stub your toe, or you step on glass. Whatever it is, you are going to pull away even before you were conscious. Now, it may seem like it was almost simultaneous, but if we could slow down the reflexive involvement into slower frames, you would see that your leg pulled back away from the glass before your face said, ouch, right? There would be a brief, it'd be faster, right? Faster is going to be moving away than you were aware of it. When it's happening to you, it almost seems like it's instantaneous, but there is a freeze frame difference in this. So these are, reflexes are going to be an automatic response because you've damaged yourself. Those nerve endings have pictured it, have sensed that problem. Now, it would take longer for that signal to go up the spinal cord to the brain and for the brain to send down instructions saying, move your leg, dummy, you're hurting yourself. So this happens at the level of the spinal cord. Again, this is involuntary, and this is the only time where your skeletal muscles would be moving involuntarily, right? If you step on something sharp with your right foot and you flex your hamstrings, right, you flex your leg, you are moving your voluntary muscles involuntarily, right? You did not choose to do that. It happened for you through a reflexive response. Typically, reflexes are not suppressible. Yes, there are people who have taught themselves, forced themselves to repress their reflexes. People who walk on hot coals, people who walk on glass, people who go on America's Got No Talent and stick knives down their throat, right? Those kinds of reflexive responses, you do it enough times, you can kind of train your body not to do that. Same thing with people who are able to beat lie detector tests, right? When you're taking a lie detector test, they're checking your pulse, they're checking for your sweat, they're looking for the pupils, and it is possible for some people to overcome those reflexive changes, and because of that, we don't allow lie detector tests as a definitive rule, right? Because there are people who have learned how to, or have the ability to, jinx it or overcome that reflex. Now, typically, reflexes, again, are meant to be a survival mechanism to move away from the pain or the problem before you sustain more damage. There's a basic wiring involved with the reflex. So there's something that is going to signal in the periphery, right? So there's going to be a pain sensation that's going to come in through the peripheral nervous system. That neuron is going to bring that system or that signal into the central nervous system. Those interneurons or the central nervous system is going to integrate and process that incoming information and send a motor neuron out to an effector. Effector is a fancy word for either a muscle or a gland. Okay? Again, it's involuntary, and not to beat this too hard, you'll see it again in lab, but there are 5 steps in every reflex. Number 1, neuron picks up the stimulus, pain, burn, whatever. Number 2, that sensory neuron is going to send that signal to the CNS. Number 3, there's going to be processing of that incoming information by an interneuron, usually. I'll show you an exception in a moment. Then there is going to be a motor neuron that sends signals out to the effector, muscle or gland, telling it to do something even though you didn't necessarily want it to. Here's your basic schematic wiring of this. So in the skin, right, there's a pin. Ouch, right? So something pricks you before you were even aware of it. That sensation had been sent to your spinal cord. Oh, look, sensory neuron always goes in the posterior root. There's the ganglion. Within that ganglion, there's the cell body for that sensory neuron, unipolar. The signal comes in the back door, synapses with an interneuron, which then synapses with an outgoing motor neuron, comes out the anterior root, goes to the muscle, and tells it to move, right, or move away from that stimulus. What this doesn't show is that there would be signals going up the spinal cord to the brain, right? They're there, they're going to happen. You're going to become aware that you just pricked yourself with that pin, but you're not going to be aware of it until after you've already pulled away. Now, let me just talk about reflexes for a couple of slides here. Reflexes come in a couple different types, ipsilateral and contralateral. Very simple. Ipsilateral means the same side of the body. So if I reach out with my right hand and I touch the hot stove and I pull back my right hand from the stove, it's all happened on the same side of the body. That'd be an ipsilateral response. If instead I'm walking along and there's a slide in the lab, you'll see that looks like this, and I step on something sharp with my right foot, not only am I going to pull my right foot away from the pain, but I'm also going to reflexively extend my left foot and catch my body weight, right? I'm not going to lift up my leg and just fall over. My body's also going to change things on the other side of the body, contralateral, to make up for that. So we have ipsilateral, more simple, more complex reflexes would also consider contralateral parts. Monosynaptic reflexes. Another way of thinking about reflexes. Monosynaptic means there's how many synapses? Mono, one. Well, how can that be? Every time up until now, I've always said that the sensory neuron goes into the interneuron, one synapse, and then the interneuron talks to a motor neuron, two synapses. But there are the simplest of your reflexes are monosynaptic reflexes. Your patellar knee-jerk reflexes of this type, right? So when you go in and you hit your patellar tendon and your leg extends out, that is a monosynaptic reflex. What that means is that the incoming sensory neuron connects directly to the outgoing motor neuron. There is no interneuron, there's no processing. It's the simplest and also the most rapid kind of reflex. The patellar knee-jerk reflex is the only one I'm describing to you this semester that is monosynaptic. Most of your reflexes will be polysynaptic. That is, two or more synapses and the involvement of some interneurons. And this is what I've described everywhere else, right? That the sensory neuron comes in, talks to an interneuron, the interneuron then speaks to a motor neuron. That would be polysynaptic. So let's look at these side by side. On the right is what we've been looking at more often. This guy's burning his hand. There's a little Bunsen burner right here. That pain sensation is going to travel to his spinal cord, go in the back door. There's my unipolar neuron. Come in, speak to an interneuron, speak to an outgoing motor neuron, telling you to move your arm away from the fire dummy. Right? So that's your typical polysynaptic reflex on the right. On the left is the monosynaptic. Again, this is your patellar knee jerk. You're at the doctor, they take out that hammer, they bang you in front of the patellar tendon. As a result, the sensory neuron comes in, but it doesn't go to an interneuron. It goes directly to and synapses with a motor neuron. It's just a special kind of wiring, and this happens, therefore, very, very quickly. Monosynaptic. Now, how does that monosynaptic work? Or how do any of these things work? Well, one of them, your muscles are responding through stretch receptors or stretch reflexes. What was that word I used again before? How is it that your body is aware of its position? Proprioception. And what that means is that your muscles and your joints are constantly sending information to your brain. You're not aware of it. But right now, every muscle in your body is sending a signal to your brain saying, my muscle's relaxed, or my muscle is tense. Every joint space in your body is sending a signal to your brain right now saying that it's bent or straight. So you have this collective information being sent to your brain. This is your proprioception, your ability to know your position in space. So when the doctor or when you tap on the patellar tendon, what does the muscle think? Let's break this down. What muscle is going across your patella and inserting onto your tibial tuberosity? What group? Quadriceps femoris group, right? Your rectus femoris being one of those. If you go back and look, you'll see your femoral nerve, your lumbar nerve comes down, right? Your femoral nerve comes down from the lumbar plexus, and that goes to your quadriceps femoris muscles. Now, when you hit that patellar tendon, what's that muscle thinking? Give your muscle a brain for a second. What's that muscle detecting? What is it thinking to itself? something just stretched me, right? When you hit that tendon, do you agree the muscle feels stretched? But the muscle's also saying to itself, this dude didn't tell me to move my muscle. I didn't tell it to move. I'm voluntary muscle, and yet my muscle just was stretched involuntarily. Well, what do all of us do when we're being stretched? We fight back, right? So the muscle does the same thing. As that muscle gets pulled unexpectedly, it reflexively contracts, moves away from that stretch. The muscles don't want to get stretched too much, right? You stretch the muscle too much, that's not good. So when the muscle all of a sudden is hit, when you hit that tendon, the quadriceps femoris muscles think, hey, I just got stretched, but I wasn't expecting it. The muscle then reflexively contracts back. What happens when your quadriceps femoris muscles contract? Leg extends, right? We know this. So you hit the patellar tendon, the muscle says, whoa, I don't like this, and the muscles contract, and the leg extends. Okay, so that's the stretch reflex that's going on. And I told you that this is a monosynaptic reflex. Now, this is a picture of a muscle. And if I said to you right now, based upon what we've learned, when I say muscle, I think most of us think motor. Right? We think, oh, you've been saying this over and over, Mac, that motor neurons go to muscles. But I also told you a moment ago that your muscles are also sending signals to your brain. That is, your muscles are not only receiving motor signals. Right? Here's motor in yellow. Yes, your muscles are receiving motor signals. And when they receive that signal, the muscle contracts. It shortens. But your muscles are also sending out blue sensory signals. That's the idea of proprioception. The muscle knows constantly, is it contracted or relaxed? So these are the stretch receptors that are in your muscles that are responding when you hit that tendon, and the muscle says, whoa, wait a second, I'm going to contract because I just got stretched. There's also, though, another protective mechanism in your muscles called the Golgi tendon reflex. This is kind of the opposite. Now, this is going to prevent your muscles from excessively tensing. The name, Golgi, same dude that described the little organelle in the cell, right? So he gets his name on two things. So we have the Golgi body or the Golgi apparatus in the cell that processes and packages proteins, and same dude described these muscle organs. So these are the Golgi tendon organs. Basically what they are, sensory neurons. These sensory neurons are located at the muscle-tendon junction. At the muscle-tendon junction. Picture's coming. When these neurons are triggered, then the muscle is going to be reflexively told to relax. Let me show this picture to you and think about this. So this is a muscle attached to a bone. We don't see the bone, but we know that tendon is the connector between them, right? And in that muscle-tendon junction are these sensory neurons, specifically called the Golgi tendon organ. Now, this muscle is tensing. Tense, 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 lifting something really, really heavy. And that muscle is tensing so hard that it's pulling on the tendon. And the tendon says to myself, this is hurting, and I certainly don't want my tendon to get snapped off my bone, do I? So what's the body going to do? Reflexively, instinctively, it's going to tell that muscle to stop contracting. So here's the deal. Have you ever been watching a bodybuilder, one of those strongman competitions, and the guy is lifting this massive weight, he's going for the gold medal, and he's in the middle of that clean jerk, and all of a sudden it's like his body goes to be a limp noodle. Right? He didn't have control over that. What happened at that moment is his muscles were contracting so hard, and all of his little Golgi tendon organs were screaming, saying, hey, dude, you're going to damage these tendons, and you might even yank them off the bone. So these little neurons send a signal to the muscle saying, relax, instinctively, reflexively, involuntarily, right? So this is another reflexive way. So we've got stretch receptors that are checking if your muscles are getting stretched. We've got Golgi tendon organs making sure that your muscles are not overly contracting. They're both making sure that your muscles are of the correct length. They're not being overstretched. They're not being overcontracted. So when you go into the doctor office, right, they may check some of your reflexes. Right? You go in, doesn't the doctor usually tap, right? Patellar tendon reflex. I'm not really quite sure why, right? You know, it's funny when your kids run into the doctor's office and they run in, the doctor asks, any concerns? Nope, just here for the physical checkup, no problem. Neuromuscular, no issues. They just jumped up on the table and they still go through the process of tapping on their knee, right? Looking for that patellar knee reflex. Now what happens if they tap 3 or 4 times and nothing happens? Are they sending you off to the specialist? Are they worried? Not usually, right? They're like, oh, you just didn't hit it quite right. No problem. It's kind of frustrating. I don't know why they do that. Okay? Now, if I walked in and I said, you know what, my kid's kind of clumsy. They seem to really be having some issues with neuromuscular connections, and I'm really worried there might be something else going on, then I would expect the doctor to go through a very thorough examination of his reflexes. If I fell off a ladder, if I was in a car accident, I would go to the ER and they would check my reflexes. Because what are they checking for? Spinal cord damage. Right? Your reflexes are controlled by your spinal cord. So if I go through and I do all these different reflexive tests, I'm able to tell, do I have perhaps some spinal cord injury? So that makes sense, right? If you've had a problem, I just don't understand the patellar knee jerk reflex all the time in the clinic. Now your reflexes can be hypoactive or hyperactive. Hopefully they're normal. If they're hypoactive, right, you're banging on the patellar tendon or you're doing all these other reflexes tests and nothing's happening, it suggests spinal cord injury or maybe muscle disease, right? Your spinal cord's fine, but your muscles aren't able to respond to it. If your reactions are hyperactive, it suggests it could be spinal cord injury or it could also be brain damage. You're just kind of, you've got tics or some sort of unexpected motion. That could also be some sort of brain damage. So here are a bunch of reflexes. You're not going to memorize this table, but I want you to see that we can test from the plantar reflex down through your foot all the way up through your biceps reflex. And each of those reflex tests is testing for different nerves along your spinal cord. When you test your patellar tendon reflex, you are doing L2 to L4, and that makes sense because I told you that the quadriceps femoris muscles, right, are coming down the front of the leg. That's your femoral nerve, and that comes off your lumbar plexus, and that's L2 to L4. So it makes sense, right? If that was not working and there was something wrong with your L2 to L4 area, you would not have that knee jerk reflex. So we can test all these reflexes up the body and check for spinal cord injuries. And that brings us to the end of spinal cord. Only about 15 minutes left, but are there any concerns over anything related to spinal cord? What do you think? Again, there's a new vocabulary, but there's also a very practical part here, right? So you have to kind of put all these pieces into the puzzle and come up with how in the world does this whole thing work. 15 minutes of brain. This is your chapter 13. Some of this you know. Some of this will look really familiar. Those who've already had lab will say, oh, we saw this. Some of you who have lab tonight will see it tonight. So this slide is mislabeled. It says CNS. What's wrong with that labeling of CNS? What is the CNS? Central nervous system, which only includes the brain and the spinal cord, right? This also includes cranial nerves and spinal nerves. They would be part of the peripheral nervous system, right? So this is not well labeled. That should not say CNS. It should just simply say nervous system, right? Just to be clear. I like this picture, though, because it even shows us what? What is this right here. You see the group of nerves, the brachial plexus, and up here, a group of nerves coming off the cervical region, cervical plexus, and see how cleanly these thoracic nerves are coming off? They can't join a plexus because they're already separated by the ribs. So we can see a few features there that we've already talked about. So the brain. This chapter will be about the brain, structures of the brain, and at the end of it, on Thursday, I'll describe to you the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come off the brain. Men, brains, on average, about 3.5 pounds. Men do have bigger brains than women. It's not because they're smarter, right? We'll talk about that. But brain size is not directly correlated with intelligence. We know that the Neanderthal man had a bigger brain. Clearly aren't smarter than we are. What creates or gives us intelligence is actually the number of active synapses. So you have billions and billions of synapses in your nervous system. The more synapses you have active, quote, the greater your intelligence. We want to keep older people mentally active to maintain their synapses. We want to encourage kids with music and art to create new synapses to give them greater intelligence. So the number of synapses. Alcohol and drugs knock out those synapses as well. Again, about 3.5 pounds. In the lab, you'll be feeling that sheep's brain. It kind of has a jiggler, firm, jello kind of feel to it. And the brain is also a oxygen hog. It is using up about 25% of all the oxygen that comes into your body, and we can't change that. Even during exercise, the brain is going to insist on getting 25% of your oxygen. The brain is protected by the same layers, basically, that the spinal cord was protected by. These are the meninges. This is not a new story for you. So you've got the cranial bones, and then you have the meninges. You also have the same cerebrospinal fluid that you saw around the spinal cord is also around the brain. There's one extra protective thing, though, with the brain, and that is the blood-brain barrier. Let me ask you right now, what cells, what glial cells were helping to maintain the blood-brain barrier?
Astrocytes.
Beautiful, the astrocytes. Up a spot, what cells were helping to create the CSF? Ependymal. Right? This is going back to chapter 11. We had 4 different kinds of glial cells in the central nervous system. There were the astrocytes, which helped maintain fluid movement and blood-brain barrier. There were the ependymal cells that made the CSF. There were the microglia that were phagocytic wandering cells, and there were oligodendrocytes that made the myelin. Cranial meninges, just a fancy word. In the last chapter, I would have called these the spinal meninges. You already know them. There's the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. They are protecting the brain, but they're also helping to protect the blood vessels that are supplying the brain. They're also creating a space for the CSF. But there's one additional feature to the cranial meninges, and that is there are some places where the dura mater will split into 2 parts and will create an area where blood is draining down from the brain. And I'll show that to you in a moment. Now these 3 meninges, if you reverse them in order, spell pad, right? P-A-D. A pad, a protective layer around the brain and spinal cord. The dura mater, we know dura means hard. It is the tougher, more fibrous, leathery kind of layer. There are 2 layers, though. Now, this is new. Around the spinal cord, it's 1 layer. Around the brain, it's a double layer. There is the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Well, periosteal sounds like it's something to do with the bone. Meningeal, a little bit deeper in the meninges. I'll show you these 2 layers in a moment. Again, these 2 layers are usually fused together into 1 layer, but there are places where these 2 layers separate, and they fill up with blood coming back from the brain. That blood is venous blood. That is, it's blue blood. It's already delivered oxygen to the brain. It's coming back down, and it's going to fill up in these spaces called sinuses. So I'll show you in a picture in a moment these dural venous sinuses in the dura, blue blood in a space. The arachnoid mater, you already seen this before. It has sort of a spider web appearance to it. That spider web appearance is because of these collagen fibers that are going to jump down into this subarachnoid space. And this again is going to be filled with, that subarachnoid space is going to be filled with CSF. Finally, we have the Pia Mater. The Pia, remember, is the most delicate inner layer, and it's going to follow every groove on the surface of the brain. Remember, those grooves on the brain are called the gyri and the sulci. So the noodles on the brain are called a gyrus, the grooves are sulci, and this Pia Mater is going to go along each and every groove and contour of the brain. I'll get through these two pictures with you today, and I think that'll be about it. We'll see. So here's one picture of the meninges. This picture's okay. There's a couple things that it doesn't show, but it does a nice job. So the dura mater, what this does not show is that the dura is really two layers. Then there's the arachnoid mater. Then those collagen and elastic fibers creating that spider webby looking layer that's in the subarachnoid space. This space would be filled with CSF. And then the pink or the red is the Pia Mater, and you can see how it follows every groove of the surface. This image also introduces something else that we have not seen or talked about yet too much. It's pointing here to gray matter, and what it's pointing to is this area, and you can see that it's kind of gray up in this area, versus this is more pink in here. This would be white matter. Okay, so we've got gray matter and white matter. Now, where is this gray matter? Along the outside edge of the brain. How is that different from the spinal cord?
Reverse.
It's reversed, isn't it? In the spinal cord, here's my beautiful drawing. Right? There's my butterfly. The butterfly was gray. And it was surrounded by, that's a G, it was surrounded by white matter. In the brain, what do we have? Gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. It's reversed. Okay. Let me go to the next picture, and this one does a nicer job of showing the gray and white. This slide also shows the two layers of the dura. So we got some skin, right? We got some hair coming out of the scalp. We have the flat bone. This is parietal bone. Flat bone, remember, is two layers of compact bone with a layer of spongy bone on the inside. This shows two layers of the dura. One layer is called the periosteal layer, because basically it is the periosteum of the flat bone. The other layer is the meningeal layer, down by the meninges, by the dura. This gap right here, that space, that's the dural venous sinus. The blue stuff in there is blood. That is venous blood, and it's where the two dura layers have separated. And there's a few of these throughout the inside of the skull. We won't be labeling them this semester, but you'll appreciate them more in 106. Then below the dura, we have that subarachnoid space with the spider web looking appearance with the CSF. The Pia Mater would be running along every groove. Then this one does a nicer job, I think, of showing the gray matter versus the white matter. So the gray matter of the brain is around the outside edge. What do we call the outside edge of an organ? C for cortex. So whenever you're talking about even a bone or the brain or the kidney or the ovary or any gland, as we move through our conversation, you're going to hear about the cortex and the medulla. Cortex is the outer layer. In bone, compact bone was also called cortical bone, the cortex on the outside. On the inside of a bone, what do we call that? The cavity was the medullary cavity, right? The center of the spinal cord, the medullary cone, right? So center of stuff are medullary or medulla. So again, white matter and gray matter, different and reverse than the spinal cord. What makes white matter white, folks? Myelin. The myelin in the brain is primarily around the axons, right? And where are these? In the center. What cells are making this myelin? Have my twitch again. Right, we're in the brain. So the myelin here is made by oligodendrocytes. What makes the gray matter gray? The lack of myelin. So in the brain, the cortex is primarily made of what? Dendrites, cell bodies. Whereas the white stuff, the medulla, is made up mostly of myelinated axons. And we'll come back, we'll see how this all fits together between the spinal cord and the brain next time. What I'll be going on to next time, talking about the regions of the brain, we'll talk about the brain, we'll talk about the cranial nerves. That'll fill up our time on Thursday. And then on Tuesday, we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system. Please, 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 don't wait on mastering assignments. This week, before I see you again, try to at least get through the mastering assignments for the introduction and the spinal cord section. And then this weekend, work on the brain. And then next week, leave just the autonomic nervous system left so that you can focus on one thing at a time.